Did you know that millions perished under colonial rule in Africa, not just from warfare, but from systematic violence and exploitation? This is the story of colonial crime history. European powers didn't just administer, they coerced. Forced labor, collective punishment, military reprisals, whippings, prison camps, forced removals, land confiscation, hostage-taking, and executions were not mere abuses, but central tools of colonial control. Consider the case of German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. Between 1904 and 1908, the German commander Lothar von Trotha, with the approval of Kaiser Wilhelm II, issued the Vernichtungsbefehl, the extermination order, in October 1904. This order drove the Herero people into the desert, blocking their access to water. An estimated 60,000 to 80,000 Herero and 10,000 to 20,000 Nama people perished. Historians and government widely recognize this as one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Then there's the Congo Free State, the private colony of King Leopold II of Belgium from 1885 to 1908. Here, rubber and ivory extraction were achieved through terror. Methods included hostage-taking, village destruction, killings, and amputations. The population may have fallen by millions during this period, though exact numbers are disputed due to poor records. The forced public violently enforced quotas, and the cutting off of hands became a symbol of the regime's brutality. British colonial punishment systems in Africa weren't much better. Indigenous-like systems in French colonies, and similar summary powers elsewhere, allowed colonial officers to punish Africans without due process. In British territories, colonial law often criminalized ordinary African life through pass laws, labor controls, tax enforcement, movement restrictions, and vagrancy laws. During the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya from 1952 to 1960, the British detention system expanded massively. By the mid-1950s, tens of thousands were detained in prisons and camps, enduring torture, forced labor, and detention without fair trial. French colonial expansion in Africa, intensifying in the 19th century and continuing into the mid-20th century, was marked by extreme violence. French forces carried out major punitive campaigns in Algeria, Madagascar, West Africa, Chad, and Cameroon. Common forms of violence included village burnings, hostage-taking, forced labor, mass reprisals, and summary executions. Colonial pacification meant military conquest and immense civilian suffering. Forced labor was one of colonialism's most common crimes. Across French, Belgian, Portuguese, German, and British territories, Africans were compelled into labor for roads, railways, plantations, mines, and military logistics. This often led to death through exhaustion, malnutrition, disease, beatings, and exposure, persisting well into the 20th century despite formal abolition. Colonial prisons were often improvisational and brutal, serving as detention sites for political control rather than modern correctional institutions. Overcrowding, inadequate food, disease, hard labor, and arbitrary punishments were common. In some areas, prisons were used to break labor resistance. What constituted crime was often defined by colonial convenience. Actions treated as normal in pre-colonial systems became crimes under colonial rule, such as failing to pay taxes, moving without permission, resisting labor demands, gathering without authorization, or carrying weapons. Colonial law transformed everyday survival into criminality. The French indigenous system allowed officials to punish Africans by decree, without full trial, including fines, confinement, and forced labor penalties, institutionalizing racial inequality. Colonial violence targeted women, who were caught in hostage systems, subjected to rape and sexual violence, forced agricultural labor, family separation, and punishment for male relatives' resistance, an often underrepresented aspect of colonial history. Massacres were frequently followed by record suppression. Colonial authorities falsified reports, minimized casualties, blamed victims for rebellion, and restricted archives, resulting in a fragmented and biased historical record. Some colonial abuses were exposed only decades later, through archival research and survivor testimony emerging after independence, especially regarding detention camp abuse, forced labor deaths, sexual violence, and collective punishment. Colonial crime shaped the modern African state, creating militarized police systems, detention-centered governance, extractive economies, and centralized coercive administrations, many of which post-colonial states inherited. Colonial violence destroyed or reshaped societies, resulting in depopulation, land dispossession, famine, displacement, political fragmentation, and the weakening of local institutions, communities losing both people and the means to reproduce social life. Extraction turned Africa into a source zone, with colonial crime tied to economic extraction of rubber in the Congo, minerals in southern and central Africa, cash crops in West and East Africa, and labor for rail and plantation systems. Violence was the enforcement mechanism for this extraction. Colonial punishment normalized racial inequality. European colonial legal systems frequently assumed Africans were subject to be controlled, not citizens with rights, legitimizing later segregation and apartheid structures. Resistance to forced labor, land seizure, and prison regimes helped fuel nationalist movements, peasant revolts, labor organizing, and independence struggles, with anti-colonial memory remaining central to political identity in many African countries. Land dispossession still shapes politics today, as colonial expropriation altered land ownership patterns in Kenya, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, and Algeria, with land inequality remaining a major political issue. Modern policing and prisons have colonial roots. Many African states inherited coercive systems designed for control rather than public service, leading to ongoing debates about police brutality, prison overcrowding, detention without trial, and emergency powers, often echoing colonial precedents. Reparations debates are now mainstream. African states, the African Union, and civil society groups have pushed for recognition of slavery, colonial crimes, looted heritage, and reparative justice, demanding historical accounting and compensation frameworks. Memory politics remain contested, with ongoing disputes over monuments, museum collections, archive access, school curricula, and official apologies, as many African countries are still fighting for a fuller public record. Colonial legal structures still influence governance, as emergency powers, land law, labor law, and administrative detention systems in some places were built during colonial rule and later adapted by post-colonial governments. Death tolls are often disputed, with exact numbers for colonial killings difficult to prove because records were incomplete or destroyed, colonial reports were biased, and many deaths came from famine and disease after violence. Historians debate precise figures, but not the reality of mass violence.